There are sets where the cameras capture everything, and sets where the most important things happen just outside the frame. The Magnificent Seven was both. In the summer of 1960, in the scorched landscape of Cuernavaca, Mexico, 7 of the most combustible personalities in American cinema were placed in proximity to each other under the relentless sun and told to make a Western. What followed, on camera, became one of the most beloved films in Hollywood history. What followed off camera, in the spaces between takes, in the loaded silences between two men who had no language adequate to the recognition they felt for each other, has almost never been fully told. The two men were Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson. And what passed between them, the refusal, the friction, the slow and reluctant acknowledgement that the person standing across from you understands something about survival that almost no one else in the room does, was not a rivalry in the way that Hollywood typically manufactures rivalries. It was something older than that, something more uncomfortable, the recognition of a mirror. But the story of what happened between them begins long before either man arrived in Mexico. It begins in the places that made them, and those places were, in their essentials, not as different as anyone looking at two such different faces would have assumed. Steve McQueen was born in Beech Grove, Indiana, in 1930, the son of a mother who could not care for him and a father who did not stay. He was sent to live with a great uncle in Missouri, a farmer named Claude Thompson, who provided the bare structure of stability without much of its warmth. By his early teens, McQueen had cycled through reformatories, petty crime, odd jobs on the margins of legitimate economy, and a childhood so fractured and relocated that the concept of home, of a place where you were known and expected and belonged, was essentially theoretical. He enlisted in the Marines at 17, served his time with the characteristic mixture of discipline and barely contained restlessness that would define everything he ever did, and emerged into the post-war world with the specific hunger of a young man who has learned that no one is coming to help him, and that forward motion is the only available alternative to sinking. He discovered acting almost accidentally and pursued it with the intensity of someone who has found the first thing that makes the interior noise quiet down. The actor's studio, small television roles, the gradual accumulation of a screen presence that was electric in a way that training alone could not have produced, because what McQueen brought to the camera was not a performance of experience, but the actual residue of it. He moved like someone who had spent years navigating spaces where a wrong move had consequences. He watched like someone for whom watchfulness had been, at various points, a survival strategy rather than an artistic choice. By 1960, he was on the edge of major stardom, not quite there yet, but close enough that everyone in the industry could feel it approaching. The Magnificent Seven was the film that would push him through that threshold. Charles Bronson arrived at the same production from a different direction, but an eerily similar starting point. Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania. 11 of 15 children. The coal mine. The father dead at 10. The war in the Pacific. The long grinding years of supporting roles and character work, and the patient, unannounced accumulation of a craft that the industry was still not entirely sure what to do with. He was 38 years old in 1960, 8 years older than McQueen, and had been working professionally for nearly a decade without receiving the recognition that those who watched him carefully believed was inevitable. 2 men, 2 devastated childhoods, 2 practices of survival so thorough they had become indistinguishable from personality, 2 faces that communicated, without any deliberate effort, the knowledge of what it costs to come through something you were not supposed to come through, and absolutely no idea, when they first encountered each other on that Mexican set, what to do with the recognition. The production of The Magnificent Seven was directed by John Sturges, a filmmaker with a talent for managing strong personalities and a pragmatic understanding that the friction between powerful actors, if properly channeled, could become the texture of the film itself. He had assembled an ensemble that included Yul Brynner, who was the established star and knew it, McQueen, who was the rising force and was determined that everyone should know it, Bronson, who was the quiet, immovable presence that everyone on set felt, but that the industry had not yet figured out how to account for, and 4 other actors of varying degrees of ambition and establishment who were navigating their own relationships to the hierarchy the production had assembled. The tension between McQueen and Brynner has been well documented, a professional competition over screen time and camera positioning that was almost theatrical in its explicitness, conducted through the specific vocabulary of actors who understand exactly what they are doing and want everyone else to understand it too. McQueen's famous habit of touching his hat brim or making small physical adjustments during Brynner's lines, subtle visual movements designed to draw the camera's attention without overtly dominating the scene, became legendary on the set and has been analyzed extensively in accounts of the production. But what happened between McQueen and Bronson was different in kind, not just degree. And it began not with competition, but with its opposite, with a refusal to engage. In the first week of production, McQueen did not speak to Bronson. Not pointedly, not performatively. He did not make a display of the avoidance in the way that on-set conflicts are sometimes staged for an audience of crew members and fellow cast. He simply did not initiate contact, did not seek conversation during the long waits between setups, did not include Bronson in the group dynamics that were already forming among the other cast members, the shared meals, the evening gatherings, the informal social architecture of a group of people spending weeks in proximity in an unfamiliar country. Bronson noticed. He noticed everything as he always had, the watching habit installed in childhood, refined in the mine, sharpened in combat, polished through years of professional observation. He noticed the avoidance, and he did not pursue its resolution. He was not a man who pursued things. He was a man who waited and watched and allowed circumstances to develop at the pace they required. The crew noticed too, and what the crew observed, with the particular attentiveness of people who work in close proximity to performers and learn to read the atmosphere of a set the way sailors read weather, was not hostility exactly. It was something more ambiguous and more interesting. McQueen watched Bronson constantly, not during scenes where the demands of performance organized attention differently, but between them, during the waiting, which on a film set constitutes the majority of the working day. He watched Bronson the way you watch something you cannot fully categorize, that does not fit the existing framework you have for understanding what you are looking at. What McQueen was looking at, though he would not have articulated it this way, was himself, or rather, a version of the thing that had made him, rendered in a different body, a different face, 8 years further along the same road. It took 10 days, some accounts say 2 weeks. The precise timeline is less important than what eventually broke it, which was not a dramatic confrontation or a forced introduction or the intervention of a director trying to manage his cast. It was something considerably more ordinary and considerably more revealing. They were waiting for a setup to be completed, one of the interminable technical delays that characterize film production, during which the cast sits or stands or moves around the edges of the set with the particular restless patience of people whose professional obligation is, at that moment, simply to be available. Most of the other cast members had drifted toward shade or conversation. Brynner was consulting with Sturgis about something in the script. McQueen was sitting on a low wall at the edge of the set, turning his motorcycle gloves over in his hands, a habitual motion, almost meditative. Bronson was nearby, doing nothing. He was simply present in the way he was always present, without performing the waiting, without filling the silence with motion or noise. He was looking at the landscape, at the particular quality of the Mexican light in the middle of the afternoon, at the way the heat made the distant hills look slightly unreal. McQueen said something, not a significant sentence. Accounts differ on the exact words, something about the light or the heat, or the length of the delay. Something small, thrown out into the silence between them, without the weight of an overture, without the architecture of a conversation being deliberately initiated. Bronson responded, also briefly, also without architecture. And that was the beginning. What developed over the following weeks was not a friendship in the conventional sense. Neither man was built for conventional friendship, for the social ease and mutual disclosure that the word typically implies. It was something more like a working understanding. A recognition, arrived at gradually and without ceremony, that the person beside you knows something about the world that most people do not know, and that this knowledge does not need to be discussed or performed or displayed. It simply exists as a fact of shared experience and changes the quality of the silence between you. They talked about motorcycles. McQueen's passion for speed, for cars, for motorcycles, for anything that moved fast enough to make the interior noise stop, was one of the most consistent facts of his life. Bronson was not a speed enthusiast by instinct, but he understood the impulse behind it without requiring explanation, because the impulse and his own relationship to physical work came from the same source: the need to occupy the body completely enough that the mind has no room left for whatever it is carrying. They talked occasionally about the work, not in the analytical, craft-focused way that actors trained in more academic traditions discuss performance, but practically, about what felt true in a scene and what didn't, about the relationship between stillness and attention, about the specific challenge of communicating something real in a context that is, by definition, constructed and artificial. McQueen, who had always trusted instinct over technique, found in Bronson something he had encountered very rarely: someone whose instincts were as developed as his own, and whose reasons for that development he understood without having to be told. Bronson, who had spent years being underestimated by an industry that did not quite know what to do with his particular quality, found in McQueen someone who looked at him and saw, without having to be convinced, exactly what was there. The film itself recorded some of this. There are scenes in The Magnificent Seven where McQueen and Bronson share the frame, and something in the quality of their mutual attention, the way each registers the other's presence with a specificity that goes beyond the requirements of the script, reads on screen as a different texture from the rest of the ensemble work. Not warmer exactly, more honest. Two instruments that had been tuned in similar conditions, producing a resonance that the other combinations in the film do not quite replicate. Sturgis noticed it. He began, as the production progressed, to frame them together deliberately, not because the script demanded it, but because the camera liked what happened when they occupied the same space. The still point and the kinetic point, the compressed endurance and the barely contained velocity. Two different expressions of the same fundamental understanding about what the world costs and what surviving it requires. But on the set, away from the camera, what was developing between them was also producing its own friction. Because recognition of this kind, the kind that finds in another person the mirror of your own most private experience, does not always feel comfortable. It can feel threatening. It can feel like an exposure of something you have worked very hard to keep interior. McQueen's professional instincts were, at this stage of his career, acutely competitive. He was aware, with the precision that ambitious actors develop for these calculations, of where attention went in any given scene, of which faces the camera preferred, of the hierarchy of impact within the ensemble. And he was aware, with a clarity that surprised him because he had not expected it from this particular direction, that Bronson was pulling something. Not aggressively, not with any of the visible strategic maneuvering that McQueen himself employed or that Brinner deployed with aristocratic confidence. simply by existing in the frame with the weight that he existed in every frame. There was a scene, one of the quieter ensemble moments in the film, the 7 men gathered in conversation, where McQueen, watching the dailies afterward, saw it clearly for the first time. The camera kept finding Bronson, not because Bronson was doing anything, because the stillness he occupied drew the eye the way a fixed point draws the eye in a moving landscape. McQueen mentioned it to Sturgis, not as a complaint, as an observation. He said something to the effect that Bronson didn't need to do anything to own a scene, which was either a compliment or a problem, depending on which side of it you were standing on. Sturgis, who had been managing this ensemble with the skill of someone herding extremely talented and extremely individual cats, understood exactly what McQueen was telling him, and told him in effect that this was simply what Bronson was, and that the film would be better for it, and that McQueen's own energy was the necessary counterweight to Bronson's gravity, and that together they produced something neither could produce alone. This was, in its way, the most accurate possible description of what the Magnificent Seven contains: McQueen's velocity and Bronson's gravity. The film holds both, and the tension between them, never resolved, never collapsed into simple friendship or simple competition, is part of what gives the ensemble its specific texture. After the production wrapped and the cast dispersed, McQueen said something in an interview, one of the relatively rare occasions when he spoke directly about another actor's craft, that has been quoted many times since, but whose full weight is not always appreciated. He said that Bronson was the most natural actor he had ever worked with, not the most trained, not the most technically accomplished, the most natural, meaning the least distance between the person and the performance, meaning what you saw on screen was not constructed, but revealed. Coming from McQueen, who built his entire professional identity on exactly this quality, who had fought for years to be recognized for the authenticity of his screen presence rather than the theatricality that the industry often rewarded. This was not a casual compliment. It was the acknowledgement of an equal, which was from Steve McQueen among the rarest things available. Bronson, when asked about McQueen over the years, in the rare interviews he consented to give, in the careful, minimal way he answered questions about anything personal, said very little. He acknowledged the work. He acknowledged the quality of the film. He did not perform emotion about the relationship or the recognition it had contained. But those who knew him, who understood the language of his silences and could read what was contained in what he chose not to say, recognized something in the way he spoke about McQueen, or rather in the particular quality of the restraint with which he did not speak about him, that communicated more than elaboration would have. A respect so complete it did not need ornament. A recognition so fundamental it did not require vocabulary. Steve McQueen died in November 1980 from mesothelioma at the age of 50. He was, at the time of his death, one of the most beloved and most analyzed figures in American cinema, a man whose story had been told many times, whose image had been reproduced on countless posters and magazine covers, whose relationship to speed and freedom and the particular American mythology of the self-made man had made him a symbol that extended far beyond any individual film. When Bronson received the news, and he was not a man who spoke publicly about personal grief, who allowed the press a window into what he carried privately, he said nothing that was recorded. He gave no interviews. He made no statements. He continued working. But on the set of his next film, a crew member who had also worked on The Magnificent Seven saw something that he remembered for the rest of his life. Bronson, between takes, sitting alone at the edge of the set in the particular posture he always adopted when the cameras weren't rolling, still interior, present in the body, but elsewhere in the mind. And on his face, for a moment that the crew member described as lasting no more than a few seconds before the professional mask returned, something that was not grief in any performed sense, but was its equivalent, the expression of a man registering the absence of something he had never named but had always known was there. The most natural actors understand, better than most, that some things cannot be performed, that the truest responses to the largest experiences are not theatrical but quiet, a shift in the quality of the stillness, a change in the texture of the silence, a moment in which the face stops managing itself and simply tells the truth. Charles Bronson's face on that set told the truth. The Magnificent Seven has been analyzed for 60 years. Its music, its cinematography, its place in the Western genre, its relationship to Kurosawa's Seven Samurai that it adapted. But what it preserved, without planning to, was something more specific and more irreplaceable. 12 weeks in the Mexican sun, during which two men who had survived things they were not supposed to survive looked at each other across a set and recognized, without words, that they were reading from the same page. The film runs for 128 minutes. The recognition it contains runs considerably longer. It runs for the entirety of both their careers, in the shared quality of what they brought to the camera, in the specific texture of authenticity that made audiences feel, watching either of them, that what they were seeing was not manufactured, but real. Two different faces, two different childhoods, spent in the specific darkness of American poverty. Two different paths through a world that had offered very little and demanded everything. And one afternoon in Mexico, when one of them said something small about the heat or the light, and the other one answered, and the silence between them changed quality, and neither of them found it necessary to remark on any of it, because men who have survived what they survived do not typically remark on the things that matter most. They simply recognize them and carry them forward, and let the camera find what it finds in the spaces between everything they chose not to say.